Hello, debate enthusiasts. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day in order to watch this evidence tutorial. My name is Herbie Kojima. I am the current Idaho Debate Commissioner. There are three intents behind this video tutorial. The first of which is to help coaches, students, and judges identify when and how we should provide a credible piece of evidence, commonly referred to as a card. Second, to help coaches, students, and judges identify the different types of evidence violations. Third, to suggest norms by which to address evidence violations during the round. This is before we adopt the NSDA procedures to address falsification in rounds, which will not take effect until next year. In the meantime, though, we need to learn the difference between what is and is not a credible piece of evidence. Before I jump into that, let me just state that this tutorial should accompany, rather than take the place of, the actual rules which define what is and is not a proper piece of evidence, which can be found in the NSDA manual. If you just hit the pause button, you can scan this code and it will take you to the manual, and you're going to be looking at pages 27 and 28 specifically, if you'd like to do that while we're talking about it. Let's start with what we hope debaters provide in the round and what we hope that judges will be able to see in the round. So a debater is responsible for the validity of all evidence. Unattributed ideas are the opinion of competitors and are not considered evidence. If sharing general information, no authoritative source proves necessary. For example, a general reference to a social contract theory in a round would not require an evidence card. If we are paraphrasing, competitors are held to the same standard of evidence accuracy. For example, if I made a specific reference to John Locke's social contract theory, then I would be required to provide a card. A credible piece of evidence must include an oral citation, which provides at the very minimum the author's last name and the year in which it was published. Additional quotes from the same citation only require the use of the author's last name. Oral citations are not a substitute for written citations, which must be shared at the request of an opponent or a judge in a timely fashion. For example, when I'm citing it orally, the first time I would state Smith in 13. If I had additional cards from that author, I would state simply Smith. A credible piece of evidence must include a written citation which provides the following: the full name of the primary author or the editor, the publication date, the publication in which the article was published, the title of the article, the date on which the evidence was accessed from the internet, and finally the complete URL if it was from an electronic source. In addition, it needs the author's qualifications, and finally, if there are, it would also need the page numbers. Here is an example of an APA citation. I want to note, though, that this is a modified APA citation since we have some additional piece of information which APA does not require us to use. So you can see that I have put my author's last name and the date in which this article was published in very large text so that it's easy not just for myself to see and read, but also for my opponents and judge if they request to see the card. You also see, though, that I have this author's credentials. I have the name of the article in which it was published. In italic, you can see the name of the publication, the volume, the issue, the page, and then the date on which I retrieved it, as well as a complete URL. Here's an example of an MLA source. Again, you can see that I've enlarged the author's last name and the date in which the document was published. However, I still have all the additional pieces of information so that I can show the validity of this card. Some debaters, in addition to enlarging the text, like to underline it, or vice versa. They do one or the other. It just needs to be very clear that there needs to be some way in which this information is marked so I know exactly where to find that information quickly as possible. A credible piece of evidence must include text from an original source, which may entail one of the following, and let me point out these are all found directly in those NSDA rules in the guide. a copy of a web page, a copy of pages preceding, including, and following the actual source used, copies of electronic versions of published handbooks, copies of electronic versions of web pages from debate institutes or the Open Evidence Project. However, I want to point out that even though these are cited in the evidence or in the manual from the NSDA, debaters are still responsible for the accuracy of all evidence. Just because it's from these sources does not mean that it is infallible and that we have to just accept it as the truth. Debaters must distinguish between which parts of a piece of evidence are and are not read in the round. So oral delivery requires the use of pauses or phrases to identify what is being read from the evidence. For example, a debater could say, mark the card or cut the card there to show that they are not going beyond that phrase. The use of clear pauses is left to the discretion of judges. I know that some judges prefer slower rate of delivery, some prefer faster rates of delivery. It's really up to the judge to clarify to the debaters how he or she would like them to identify when they're moving on in a piece of evidence. Written text must mark what is read. This is done by underlining, highlighting, or increasing the font size, or a combination of these could be used as well. And we'll be showing some examples of that. So right here I have a card. You can see once again that I have my authors enlarged as well as the date so that I know to read that. I've also enlarged the text that I plan to read from the card, since I'm not planning to read every single word in this in order to still have time to read all the pieces of evidence I need to include in my allotted time. In addition to enlarging the text which I intend to read, I might also want to underline and or highlight the words which I'm going to read. This makes it easier for all the participants in the round. For me as the debater, it makes it easier to read my evidence quickly, or at least be able to find things quickly. It also makes it easier for my opponents who want to check what I've read to ensure that no falsification has taken place. It will also provide the same means for my judge so that he or she can ensure that I'm not falsifying this evidence. Now, I've heard of scenarios where debaters, when asked for evidence, instead of handing a card which is marked, will simply hand a card with nothing marked on it. Or in an even bigger scenario, they might hand an entire article to them with nothing marked. I think this would be falsification on a couple levels. First of all, it's non-existent evidence because even though it's somewhere in that article, it's sort of like an Easter egg hunt to try to figure out what was read. And second, I would say it does provide a scenario where clipping evidence is very likely because we don't know what they actually read and we have no way to validate it. We'll talk about what those mean specifically in just a moment. Some debaters might ask, well, I want to make my cards nice and clean, and so rather than having all that extra text in there that I'm not even planning to read anyway, why don't I just take it out and insert ellipses, which you can see I've done here with the 3 dots for all the sections I've removed. That way I just know to read every card, or every word on the card, and it makes it a lot easier for me. This is actually considered a form of falsification because I cannot see the text that was removed to ensure that this debater is not changing the context of what this author intended. You can see here that I've completely removed those ellipses, so I have no idea, if this were not my card, that my opponents have even removed anything, and so it could completely change the intent of the card. This also would be a form of falsification. So let's talk about what the different types of falsification are. These include violations stemming from what a credible piece of evidence should entail, which we already covered. So an oral or written piece of evidence does not include a citation or all of its requisite parts. A piece of evidence is not from a published original source. We already talked about those sources. A piece of evidence or original source is not made available to an opponent or judge in a timely fashion. Or a piece of evidence includes ellipses, we just covered those, which are not in the original source. I do want to clarify, if the ellipses are there because the author included them when he or she is quoting from a different source, those ellipses, of course, could be included. But you, as a debater, are not permitted to add ellipses in order to remove parts from the card. In addition to the other forms of falsification which we already covered, the NSDA manual explicates 4 specific instances of falsification, which include distortion of evidence, non-existent evidence, clipping evidence, or straw arguments. And we're going to cover each of those in detail right now. The first type of falsification is called distortion of evidence, which entails one or both of the following. When the textual evidence contains added or deleted words which alter the conclusion of the author or authors, or failure to bracket added words. On this card, you can see that on the very first line of the text, it ends with Iraq and Afghanistan have not. If I, as the debater, removed the word not in order to change the intent of the card, this would be considered a form of distortion. In other words, this would be falsified evidence. This is one of the clearest cases of falsification because the debater cannot claim that he or she did not understand they were doing it. They clearly had the intent of changing what this author was trying to say. The next form of falsification is called non-existent evidence, which entails one or more of the following. A debater is unable to provide the original source or copy of relevant pages when requested by the judge or opponent or tournament official. The original source does not contain the evidence cited. A paraphrased source lacks an original source to verify the accuracy of the paraphrasing. Or a debater declines to provide an original source to an opponent upon request in a timely fashion. As you can see on this card, it does contain all the components that we discussed it needs in order to be considered a fair piece of evidence. I've got the author and the date enlarged and underlined. You can see that I've underlined and enlarged all the text I plan to read. However, if in the course of the round I am not able to provide this to my opponents or the judge, or I simply refuse to, then that would be considered a form of falsification. Clipping evidence entails a debater claiming to read the complete text of a marked piece of evidence when in actuality the contestant skipped or omitted portions from the evidence. I do want to note that debaters who can claim miraculously to read through pages and pages of evidence with amazing clarity are more likely than not to have clipped the cards. So as you can see, once again, we have our card here. It is a perfect card. It's got everything it needs on it. However, during the round, I know that I'm running out of time, and so instead of reading all the text that I have underlined, I choose to only read the first line, which I haven't read here, and the last line, which I also haven't read. This would be considered clipping evidence. The final form of falsification, which the NSDA outlines, is a straw argument, which entails a position or argumentative claim introduced by an author in order to refute, discredit, or characterize it. It becomes a straw argument when a debater asserts that the author endorses the claim as his or her own position, when in actuality they're simply trying to refute it. I want to note that a debater who acknowledges using a straw argument when verbally first introduced into the round would not be falsifying evidence. It becomes a straw argument when it is not acknowledged and an opponent has to question his or her opponent in order to learn that it is a straw man. So if this card here were simply a position which these two authors were going to refute in the following paragraph, then that would be considered a form of the straw man. So now that we've gone over what we're hoping to see as far as evidence goes and what we're hoping to avoid, let's discuss what these have to do with the 2017 State Debate Tournament. The tournament will recognize these definitions of evidence violations at State Debate because currently our Idaho Debate Code does not possess a definition for evidence falsifications. It does tell us that it provides grounds for disqualification, but we have never had a definition for it. We will be using the NSDA definitions. I do want to clarify though that when we started this video, we talked about the pages on which you should be reading to learn these definitions. If you go beyond that, it discusses the processes and procedures to address these. We will not be using these this year at the 2017 State Debate Tournament. However, the rule has already passed, and so that, in fact, next year at the 2018 State Debate Tournament, we will be using these, and this will change it dramatically. But please do not try to stop the round, debaters, in order to make a falsification claim. This needs to be debated in rounds, and judges need to verify evidence within the round. So what can we do about this to ensure that we aren't going to have issues with this at the State Debate Tournament? As coaches, we can learn the rules for evidence and evidence violations, learn how to recognize the differences in the rounds. We can teach our debaters these rules and require them to utilize them in all cases, extensions, and blocks. We can verify that our debaters are teaching and using these rules with all members of our squads. Finally, we can teach and verify that our judges recognize and follow these evidence rules consistently. As students, we can learn the rules for evidence and evidence violations. We can learn how to recognize the difference in rounds. We can teach our partners and teammates these rules and require them to utilize them in all cases, extensions, and blocks. We can practice using these rules and verify that our opponents are using them during rounds. Finally, we can use the round to teach and verify that our judges recognize and consistently follow these rules. Judges, you are crucial to this cultural change. As judges learn the rules for evidence and evidence violations, learn how to recognize the difference in rounds. Teach less experienced judges the rules for evidence and evidence violations. Consistently request questionable evidence to ensure veracity and integrity in all rounds. Finally, consistently report falsified evidence to the tabulation room. As I explained earlier, this procedure will change next year in 2018, but for this year, it is the responsibility of all judges to report this to the tab room. Debaters, judges, and coaches, cultural change is not easy. But in our current political climate, I think it's crucial that we emphasize the importance of evidence that we can trust in our debate community. These evidence rules will ensure more consistency between our IDC and the NSDA rules, which is our overall goal here. Just want to leave a quick quote with you. Study the rules so that you won't beat yourself by not knowing something. Although we want state debate this year to be a fun experience for everyone, we also want to ensure that we have the highest level of ethics in all evidence that we present. So please be sure that you learn and follow these rules regardless of your position in our community. It's crucial that we all follow this. Thank you for taking the time out to watch this video tutorial. Please pass this on to others who you know need to be familiar with this, and we will look forward to seeing all of you at our State Debate Tournament.